and welcome to Cafe Cinema. I'm Griff.
I'm Jacob.
And today we're going to be talking about The Northman. It came out this year, directed by Robert Eggers, written by Robert Eggers and Sion, I think is his name. It's a mononym, obviously a Scandinavian pronunciation.
Right, it's spelled S-J-O with an accent N.
Yeah. Presumably that's where a lot of the cultural aspects come in, because there's, for as much as I have been able to read, being kind of a mild history buff, this is a very accurate portrayal of Scandinavian life during that time. And for anyone who may not know what the movie is about, it's about a king who gets murdered by his brother, and then his son goes into exile and later comes back to avenge him. If that sounds familiar, it should, because the legend of Amleth, the Scandinavian legend, is largely what inspired Shakespeare to write Hamlet. So this is the origin of that very familiar setup, and it's interesting to see it coming back here.
Well, and, a lot of... we see a lot of that story play out in a lot of different films. Most notably for my childhood being
The Lion King?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because The Lion King is just Hamlet for kids.
Right.
In Africa. But, I mean, that's Shakespeare. You can see his DNA all over media. And The Northman isn't like a one-to-one retelling of the myth of Amleth. It's actually a lot closer to the Hamlet play than it is the original tale. I think there's an aspect of like Amleth pretending to be insane so that his uncle doesn't see him as a threat. Lots of characters are totally different or totally non-existent in some of the older versions. But, I mean, he took the essence of this. This is Eggers, and this is something that he does a lot. He did it with The Witch, and he did it with The Lighthouse, where he kind of distills the essence of that kind of storytelling and just brings it to life beautifully.
Oh, yeah, which makes it a lot easier to comprehend and kind of take in as well. I feel like with a lot of Shakespearean story, there's a lot of... a ton of details that goes into it, and a ton of explaining the reasoning behind whatever plot point you're trying to do. And it seems like Eggers kind of takes that and makes it, takes that and cuts it up into easy to digest chunks.
And also with more complex and dynamic performances, because with a lot of Shakespearean text, part of the reason why everyone has to say exactly what they're feeling is because the audience is far away. They can't see all of the little facial expressions. In a movie, you have a lot more room to work, and so he brings out just beautiful, beautiful performances from all of his actors to really convey non-verbally how they're feeling. I think some of the best non-verbal acting in this movie, especially from Alexander Skarsgård, who plays the lead, the way that he's just hunched over like an animal. We'll get into all of the animal imagery and symbolism in a little bit.
So what was the, if you could pick one or two things in this movie, what impressed you the most?
The costuming, like the costume and set design was absolutely beautiful. It's Robert Eggers. It's, if you know his movies, that's not a surprise, but everything was like historically researched. Almost every piece of armor or weaponry is like analogous to something that was actually found in a museum. Like you can look at side by sides of this costume and this grave find from an actual Viking king. So how beautiful and authentic it looks, and just how it actually represented Vikings pretty well. Because that's something that almost never happens. They're always depicted in like the leather armor or just almost naked, when in reality they were wearing these like these long woolen shirts. If you were someone of wealth or of royalty, you would have a chainmail hauberk or like lamellar armor, which is little pieces of metal like attached to a piece of leather armor, and that's the best costume when Uncle Fjolnir is doing the ambush scene. Absolutely beautiful. That's really what stuck out to me. How about for you?
For me, it was the cinematography. There's, I mean, it's classic Eggers style. Like, if you take The Lighthouse as a good example of what his, cinematography style is, this is just right out of the same book.
Yeah, absolutely. So, cinematographer was a guy named Jaron Blaschke, probably mispronouncing that, but the same cinematographer that worked on both The Lighthouse and The Witch.
Which totally makes sense. You see a lot of side to side movement. You see a lot of setup frames that the camera is the main source of motion instead of what the characters are doing.
Yeah.
Another great director that does that really well is Wes Anderson. You can see a lot of you could take any frame out of either one of their movies, either Eggers or Anderson. You could take a frame out of their movie and probably put it up on the wall, and it would be a piece of art. It's every single still frame is planned, and the motion to get from frame to frame, from plot point to plot point, generally is through some motion of the camera. You don't see a whole lot of zooming. You don't see a whole lot of panning is done very deliberately and usually quite slowly.
And almost always like for a purpose.
Oh, yes.
It's not just to keep the camera moving. It's not like in an action scene where the camera's going all over the place. It's very slow, very deliberate, very purposeful.
Right. And I think that's one of the really one of the signs of a solid movie is that everything has its purpose and its place.
Yeah.
And you were talking about costumes earlier, like that. That everything in that costume design had its purpose and had its place.
This is a great example of a movie where all of the different pieces, because film is such a collaborative process, all the different pieces just come together so well. From the writing side to the directing, the performances themselves, to the costume and set design, to the cinematography, everything just comes together, and it complements everything else beautifully, and it also balances out. So like the cinematography being as beautiful as it is doesn't take away from the performance. Like you're not distracted away from what's happening between the actors on screen by the way that it's presented.
Right, and that itself, like when I was learning how to make short films and stuff like that in school, that was the thing that was drilled into me by my teachers, was that if as soon as you take the audience out of the experience, you lose them. And if you can keep the audience in the experience for as long as possible, then you're doing something right.
Yeah. And I think this once again just proves how good these people are at their craft.
Oh, totally.
Also, probably the most accessible of Robert Eggers' movies, because it's like on the surface, it's a fairly straightforward revenge story. Again, it's the Hamlet plot, as it's not the acid trip that The Lighthouse is, or the atmospheric slow burn. It's got those elements, but it's more subdued than The Witch. The Witch is more of a character study than anything. You're just living on this farm with these characters, watching them degenerate. So I guess this concludes our non-spoiler part of the discussion.
Yes.
See it.
Yep, go watch it, then come back.
Yeah, it definitely benefits from being watched on a big screen.
100%.
So that you can see all the little details, all the just sweeping, gorgeous camera movements.
Oh, yeah.
So, high recommend from me. It's already one of my favorite films of the year.
Yeah, me too. It's very much up there for me, and I definitely recommend going and seeing it.
Okay, so should we just get into the plot?
Yep, this is your last warning. Don't I'm not going to be responsible for,
Yeah, it takes, for as predictable as the setup is and how familiar the setup is, it takes some turns.
Oh, yeah.
And that's something that I was really pleased with. So we open up in, I think it's Denmark. I don't know for sure. But it's a little kingdom on the coast. We see tiny baby Amleth, and his father's just come home, who is Ethan Hawke, King Arvandil Warraven. Viking king, he's come back from raiding. Little Amleth is so excited to see his father. And this is another thing that I really appreciated is that a lot of cultures back in that day, children were very androgynous. And so they wore like dress-length garments. They wore their hair in like a similar style. He's got like the longish bowl cut because children were not seen as sexual beings. And so they weren't differentiated in the same way between boys and girls until they actually hit puberty. So that's a little bit of stuff that got me early on and that I absolutely loved. So, King Arvandil, played beautifully by Ethan Hawke, comes home. Little Amleth runs to tell his mom, played by Nicole Kidman, Queen Gudrun. And so this is kind of some foreshadowing because I've seen it twice now. And on the second time you pick up, she isn't very nice to him.
Right.
She doesn't, like, her first words to him are never come into my room without permission. To be fair, she is dressing. Like, as soon as the door opens, like, that's when her shirt is coming down to cover her. So she's got some reason to be mad, but she doesn't seem to like Amleth very much.
No, he seems to be more of a bother and more of a nuisance than anything else, maybe something a little unwanted at first.
And that kind of supports his just rose-tinted view of the world at that age before he grows up and kind of learns that things were a little bit more complex than he thought originally. So King Arvandil and his brother Fjolnir, played by Clay Spang, another one of the standout performances for me.
Oh, yeah.
He's the lead in Netflix's Dracula show that I haven't watched. That's all that I know him from. Really good performance. I was expecting him to be the cartoonishly evil Scar, essentially. And he was actually written and portrayed a lot more sympathetic than that, especially in the latter half of the story. So everyone parades through town. Again, they've got the center handle Viking shields, and they've got the spears, and they've got the traditional like Viking helmets that have the eye guards. Absolutely beautiful. And they have their ceremonial feast welcoming everyone home. Ethan Hawke comes up and he says, you're too young, or you're too old to be greeted as a child, but a father is never too old for a hug from his son. And he picks him up and hugs him, and that's a really sweet moment, I thought. He and Nicole Kidman already seem a little bit distant. Like they're not ecstatic to see each other. Right. She immediately asks about Fjolnir. Where's your brother?
Yeah, big red flags.
Yeah, he kind of dismisses her. He's like, oh, she'll be here. Eventually, Fjolnir shows up, and Nicole Kidman offers her a drink offers him a drink from her horn. And this is where we get the best character of the movie. Hymir the Fool, played by Willem Dafoe. And he comes up and he essentially says, oh, look, the queen is fucking other men. And he slaps. He's got this, it looks like a big cloth strap on. Just this massive exaggerated codpiece. He's the court jester. And he slaps it around. Fjolnir gets upset. And then Ethan Hawke is like, no, it's fine. It's like when when you're in a relationship and your friend starts like making fun of your girlfriend and she gets mad and you're like, it's fine. They're just joshing.
Just sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, which I mean, also kind of a red flag on his part.
Oh, big time.
So there's the whole feast scene. Then we see that Ethan Hawke has been injured. He's got this nasty stomach wound. He has a talk with Nicole Kidman about how he doesn't want to die a shameful death in bed. He has to die in battle because in that belief system, that was how you got into Valhalla.
Right.
Is you had different
Valhalla
retellings have different versions. Like in some stories, it's that you have to actually be holding a weapon in your hand when you die. In this case, it's just you have to be killed by a weapon, by iron, in order to get to Valhalla. But it's very important that you die in battle. Nobody dies of old age.
Right, everyone has to be killed.
Yeah, and she assures him, you're gonna die in battle. Another kind of bit of foreshadowing, knowing what we now know.
Right. But when you see it for the first time, it almost seems like she is comforting him.
Yeah, like she's consoling him.
Right.
Because he's obviously very concerned at the idea that he'll die in a sickbed.
Yeah.
That he wants to get into Valhalla. He wants to die in battle.
Yeah, it almost seems like she, up until this point, you don't see the classic wife of a wife of a king or a queen excited to get her husband away from everyone so they could spend time together.
Yeah.
But you do see kind of the like stoic matriarch vibe almost. Like
definitely.
I kept the kingdom.
Like this marriage is my duty.
Right, and I'm going to do my duty, which at least in terms of writing, I think is a really good way to portray her before what comes next.
Yes, I think definitely her portrayal here is really good. They also talk about whether or not Amleth is ready to become king if his father dies. This is the first of a through line where they are always comparing Amleth to an animal. She says here he's just a puppy. And I think she calls him her son at one point in the movie. The rest of the time, he's called a puppy, a cub, a wolf, a bear. He's rarely referred to as a person. And I think that comes into play with what his arc towards the third act ends up being. And so that's what kind of starts here. Ethan Hawke takes him on the weirdest father-son bonding activity. They hike out into this temple in the woods, and they strip down into their loincloths and crawl into a cavern underground where Willem Dafoe is there with, it looks like a Viking version of a BDSM gimp mask, and he says, who is it barking? Is it the village dogs or is it wolves? More of the animal imagery. Ethan Hawke and young Amleth are crawling around like dogs, barking, and he gives them, I forget what he calls it like the meat of dreams or something, but he gives them bowls, again, like a dog, with, it looks like meat and mushrooms. So they're doing shrooms this whole scene. That's a lot of the weird imagery that Eggers is famous for takes place either in like near-death experiences or dreams or just
trip sequences.
People are high, and this is possibly the best one. It's like an initiation ritual. Willem Dafoe is getting down on all fours. He's also just in a loincloth. He's in a loincloth and this mask.
This is also how I saw the Green Goblin.
That's how the Green Goblin should have looked.
This No Way Home garbage, I don't see it.
I'm something of a Northman myself. No, but so they do this initiation ritual. They decide, kill the boy Jon Snow, let the man be born. They're saying this is the end of your childhood. You have to be a man. He makes them swear, if anything happens to me, you have to avenge me. Willem Dafoe catches his tears as falling and turns it into a diamond or some sort of gemstone, and he says, this is the last tear you'll ever shed in weakness, and it'll come back when you need it, and he tucks that away. And then to show them how connected they are, Ethan Hawke makes young Amleth touch his open wound, and that's when we get the shot. It peels back his torso, and we see the image of a beating heart, that the veins above it turn into the roots of a tree, and we pan up, and it's in this blue purple space ether, and the branches of the tree are connected like umbilical cords. They start off looking like skeletons and mummies, and they get more and more defined as obviously being people. These are their ancestors, and then it finally gets to Ethan Hawke, and then the next one up is young Amleth, holding a sword, and he's got a gilded helmet. And so they have that lovely bonding experience. Next morning, they're walking back from the temple, and this scene was a little bit more abrupt than I was expecting. I was expecting a little bit more tension and foreboding before we get into it, but it just gets into it. He's just walking, and then an arrow shoots right into his shoulder.
Which I honestly almost like that more than having a few more scenes with.
Oh, absolutely.
The characters. I think it's I think it makes it seem more real to the time period. Of course, it would make sense for an attack to happen.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right after, when they're alone.
And also, that's how abrupt it is from Amleth's point of view.
Right.
That tragedy just happened in an instant and took away everything. So he gets shot. He tells Amleth, run. Amleth doesn't run very far. He hides behind a log, and this is where we get my favorite costume, because Fjolnir and his men show up, and they look so good. The costuming. He himself has a long, flowing fur mantle that is a real garment. It's a real thing that was worn in that time. He's got the helmet that has a chainmail veil covering his face, but that would also protect the neck and the lower half of the face. And then when he takes the helmet off, reveals himself to be Fjolnir, he opens his, it's like a shawl, and you can see the lamellar armor, you can see his awesome swords. I love this costume. And they have the super poetic exchange of, oh, you're shocked to see me, I knew you would. I think that Fjolnir is his half-brother, because here's when he says, oh, it's a shame you never paid heed to a bastard's eye before. And then Ethan Hawke says, killing me won't make any half-blood a king. So I think that their half-brother is Fjolnir, is their father's illegitimate child.
Right.
And then he essentially, at this point, he's been Boromir'd. He's got 3 arrows, one of them sticking out of his neck, and Fjolnir's guys are on horseback, proving how effective cavalrymen were.
Right.
Because they are a good 4 feet away from him still, and they've got their spears in him. He's done. And Ethan Hawke essentially curses him and says, this victory won't last. Your kingdom is going to crumble. He says, my ring will be soaked in my blood and will fall off of you like a snake. And then starts goading him to strike. He does. It takes him a couple of hits, but he takes his head off. That's relevant for later. Amleth sees the whole thing, freaks out. Fjolnir says, bring me the boy's head. And then all of his guys go out and chase him. He does a very clever misdirect where he hides under a log until they go past, and then he sneaks out. one of the guards pins him down to the ground and says menacing things to say to a child. And then the kid just grabs... It took me... Like, I wasn't 100% sure what happened the first time I watched it, but he grabs his dagger and slices off the tip of the guy's nose.
Yeah.
And that's how he's able to get away.
That's one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie, too, is the idea that, like, Amleth is already, like, his father's body isn't cold yet, and he's already starting to take chunks out of people to get towards his
Well, and this is just him trying to survive.
Right.
It's just pure instinct. And then he runs back to the village. We get this beautiful kind of tracking shot as he's going through the village, and there's people falling, there's people dying. He grabs like a shawl off of a corpse and wraps himself in it so that no one recognizes him as the now noseless person. Comes up and he says, Fjolnir, I killed the kid, he's in the ocean. So they think that Amleth is dead. Fjolnir carries the mother, Nicole Kidman. He carries her down the road while his men are chanting, oh look, Fjolnir's found a wife, and she's screaming, or at least we think that she's screaming.
Right.
We, seeing it through Amleth's perspective, see her as screaming. And so this is where like that hot-blooded kind of revenge, it kind of fizzles out for a little bit. And he knows that this isn't a fight he can win. He just runs to a boat and leaves. And that whole intro ends with him. It's the scene from the trailer where he's rowing away saying, I will avenge you, father, I will save you, mother, I will kill you, Fjolnir. And then cut years later, at least
20 years.
Is it 20 years?
It's 20 years,
okay.
Yeah. On Rotten Tomatoes, it says 2 decades later.
Okay.
So, if you...
I was thinking that it was like at least 17.
Yeah.
Because Thorir, Fjolnir's older son, who we meet during the feast scene as a baby, he looks like he's at least 17. At least like medieval 17.
Yeah, coming into age.
Yeah, I would put him like between 17 and 22. So yeah, that tracks. So considerably later, we meet up with Amleth in the land of the Rus, which is modern-day Ukraine, and he is now with a group of berserkers, which, I mean, they were a group of warriors that went around either in animal clothes or without a shirt. Some of the records are a little bit foggy on it, but as they're depicted in this, they're a group of raiders that they essentially have a ritual the night before a raid where they say, we are animals now. We are fully animal spirits until we do this ritual again and become humans. And that's just how they hype themselves up for battle. And then they do this incredible raid sequence.
Oh, yeah.
When it like is a hard cut from adult Amleth, now he's Alexander Skarsgård, just screaming his lungs out with this wolf's head, and then just smash cut to dawn in the field, and they're creeping up to this village. Beautiful piece of choreography when the guard on the village wall says they're here and he throws the spear. Amleth catches it in midair and does a spin and throws it back. I don't know how feasible that is, but like a spear is going to be, it's more feasible than like an arrow.
Sure.
Or something like that. I believe that maybe someone in peak physical condition with really good reflexes could maybe do that.
And hit the target too. Like that was the other impressive thing.
And then they scale the walls. Don't know why that wall didn't have a pit or a moat.
Right.
A moat might have been too advanced. This takes place in like the 9th century.
Right.
So probably a moat isn't too advanced, but like it's a smallish village. It's not.
Yeah, it's not
town.
It's not set up well to defend.
Yeah, but still, they should have a pit.
Yeah.
But it's forgivable for all the other stuff that this movie does right.
Right.
But the reason that they should have a pit is exactly what happens, because the berserkers just scale the walls and start just doing away with everybody inside. And we find out that their main export is slaves, which is another thing that I appreciate with, I mean, it's not like a historical movie. There's a lot of fantastical elements, but with how grounded it is, the fact that it deals with that, specifically what I like is that it doesn't do the thing that a lot of historical movies that involve slavery do, where they just like give the good guys completely modern sentiments for it and say, oh, these are the good guys because they know that slavery is wrong and they're avidly against slavery, and the bad guys are bad because they think that slavery is okay and they mistreat their slaves. Key example is The Patriot, how Mel Gibson is portrayed as like, he bought all these slaves and then freed them and he pays them a wage. Just in that movie, just to show he's a good guy. We don't have to have complicated feelings about him and his motivations existing in a time when slavery existed, because he looks at it like we do. So I like that they are willing to keep things ambiguous and that they trust the audience. Because, spoiler alert, none of these characters are really great people.
Oh, yeah.
With the exception of Anya Taylor-Joy, they're all participating in this awful thing. Because this is, like, immediately after we see his home village getting destroyed and being so affected by it, we immediately transition in him doing that exact same thing to another village. There's a lot of stuff in this movie where it's someone being affected by this and then turning around and doing the exact same thing. It's a cycle.
Well, it's a classic, mental break. Abused people get abused.
Right.
Or abused people abuse others.
Yeah. And so there's some genuine atrocities. They're like taking the kids that are too young to be slaves and locking them in a barn and lighting it on fire. They're taking the people who are too old and just cutting their throats in the street. It's brutal.
Oh, yeah.
And then Amleth is just sitting there stone-faced. Like he's either not affected by it at all, or he's so affected by it that he's completely shut down.
Yeah, and that's something that you can't really tell either. It seems like, at least from my first viewing of it, it seemed that it was almost robotic. Like he had gone there to do a job, and he did, and he wasn't asked to do anymore. So he's just standing.
That's what I took away from it too.
Yeah,
and this is also where I'm like 96% sure that this is Anya Taylor-Joy's character. It's kind of in the background, and there's no close-ups, but it's while we're panning through the destruction of this village, and she's walking up, acting like she's offering a loaf of bread to one of the berserkers. And then when he goes to take it, she throws it away and she's got a knife under it, and she tries to stab him and then gets subdued and put with the rest of the slaves. So I think that's the introduction of her character. Perfect introduction for who she is and the way that Anya Taylor-Joy plays her. So cutting from that, we see their celebration, which is further messed up stuff. They take in a couple of the lady slaves and are starting to pass them around for not good things. And that's when Amleth leaves, which is another part of what makes me think like he's not 100% down with this.
Right.
But he's not like passionate. He's not going to stand in the way of it.
Right.
He's more trying to be neutral.
He still sees the value of being with the group, so he's not going to do anything to deter that place.
Yeah. And so he goes on a walk around the charred village, and he encounters Bjork. Bjork plays the seeress. And she reads him his fortune. She lays out the plot of the movie. You're going to have to go to Iceland, and you're going to have to avenge your father. You've run from this for too long. You're going to have to avenge your father, kill your uncle in the shadow of this volcano, in a burning lake. And he kind of rightfully says, because she acknowledges, you destroyed my village and your people plucked out my eyes. And she's got just these darkened eye sockets, and the shells that are hanging from her headdress, because this is another gorgeous costume. It's so good. But the shells are hanging over her eyes in a way that, like, the opening in the shell looks like a slit pupil, and it gives her like a three-eyed serpent look. And he rightfully says, "Why are you telling me this? Why are you reading my fortune?" And she says, "In order, or like, your story has to play out for someone else's story to begin," who we later learn is Anya Taylor-Joy from this village. So that makes more sense.
Right.
And she gives him back the diamond teardrop from the Willem Dafoe scene. And so this is where he decides, okay, I have to go and avenge my father. I have to deal with this trauma now. And so the next morning he goes up to one of the other berserkers because he knows that these slaves are going to Fjolnir. And he says, okay, what's the deal with this Fjolnir guy? And that's where we get the exposition that not long after the ambush, another kingdom, I think the King of Norway, it's meant to be, comes in and just takes over. Yep. The kingdom is completely lost. They say he killed his brother for nothing. So he and his family have fled to Iceland, and they're sheep farmers now. So he decides that's going to be his passage. So he cuts his hair, he brands himself, which is ouch. Yeah, and that's another thing. They don't revel in it, but at the same time they don't try to sugarcoat the fact that this story involves slavery and that slavery was very
accepted thing.
Yeah, it's not chattel slavery. It's like abduct people or have prisoners of war, but still, slavery is slavery. It's bad. But so he decides he's going to pretend to be a slave. So he brands himself, he cuts his hair, he gets into slave's garb, and he dives into the water and swims out to the boat. And this is where we officially meet Anya Taylor-Joy as Olga of the Birch Forest. And she essentially says, "You're not fooling anyone. If you want people to believe that you're a slave, then you need to act like one." And so they are sailing over to Iceland. Big storm hits, presumably just wrecks the boat, because we see them sailing through the storm. Next thing we see, there's cargo and bodies floating over everywhere, and they're trudging up onto land. I guess it was just a stroke of luck that they happened to wash up exactly where they were planning to land and meet with Fjolnir's men anyway, because they're just there on the beach.
Right, waiting.
Yeah, and Amleth, I almost called him Hamlet, is trying to hide his face because one of the guards is the guard with the missing nose.
Which, that was the thing that I also really liked, is the fact that, like, we know that we're in, Fjolnir's country now because
of that
there's
guy.
That guy.
Yep. And he's like token main henchman guy that's recognizable because of X scar.
Yeah.
So we're here in Iceland, he and Olga, while they're like chained up hiking to the farm, they have their little exchange, and she's like, "Why did you want to come here?" And he essentially says, "I'm only here to kill my uncle, and then I'm going to leave." She says, "I'm also going to leave. Maybe we should team up." And that's kind of it. That's the only thing that kind of disappoints me about the movie, is that I wish that Olga had a little bit more to do, rather than mainly being a sounding board for Amleth and then a motivation for him in the second half of the movie. But I still love her.
Yeah.
So they get to the farm. We see Fjolnir and Gunnar, who is the youngest son that he had with Nicole Kidman. And Gunnar is being a little brat because they're doing manual labor, the two of them, and he's saying, "Why are we doing this? This is slaves' work." And he essentially says nobody knows if they're going to spend next Yuletide as a king or as a slave, so you should prepare for both. And you should also show your slaves that you're as strong as they are. and he's still being kind of a little brat. But this is where, like, I wasn't expecting them to humanize Fjolnir in, like, he's still doing this awful stuff, and he's trying to be a little bit more honest. He's trying to make his own success as much as you can while benefiting from slave labor.
Right. Trying to make at least a little bit of a life from the one that he had lost off screen.
Yeah, so there's just that little kernel of humanity in him. Then he goes to examine the slaves. He essentially says all these people are too weak, just sell them. Amleth knows this is where he needs to be, and so he just, like, stands up and he just pulls on the chain and pulls everybody over to get their attention, because their justification is like, oh, all these slaves are too weak, they're not going to last the winter. And here's this massive 6-foot guy. Here's where his physicality really comes into play, because he kind of hunches over, he glowers. There's a really animalistic aspect to his portrayal. He introduces himself as Bjorn, which means bear. And he says, okay, we'll take this one, we'll take a couple of the other slaves, these 3 women, including Anya Taylor-Joy. It's like the youngest gunner comes up and he says, well, Mom needs 2 for the kitchen, 1 for the laundry. And so he says, okay, we'll take 3, and then we'll take you just for me. And he looks at Anya Taylor-Joy. Immediately the little bit of, oh, maybe it's not so bad, just goes away.
Erased.
Like, yep, no, that's not okay. He gets his later on, but... And so those are the slaves that are allowed to stay. They have their little introduction. There's a little bit of just kind of existing on the farm, getting the lay of the land. They're building a temple. Amleth gets a peek at it, and he sees, like, a tapestry with the heart tree imagery that he had during his vision. He sees Nicole Kidman, like, tending to Fjolnir's hair lovingly. Strangely, like, closer than we ever saw him with his own father, which is also relevant. So there's a little bit of time just kind of adjusting to the farm before he decides to escape. He climbs out and he sees the Cirrus says follow the vixen's tail, so I think, I'm not 100% familiar with this specific animal, but I'm guessing it's a vixen. It's like a little fox thing. And he sees it stealing a hen one night. While he's, like, looking, he goes to the kitchen and, like, tries to steal a knife when he gets distracted and sees it. And so he follows the vixen to a cave where the script calls him the He-Witch. I thought for most of the scene that it was Stellan Skarsgård. I still think that it should have been. I think that would have been fun.
Oh, yeah.
But he's almost like cross-dressing. He's got, like, the typical druid cone-shaped hat with the runestone, but then he's also got the kind of smock dress that all the women wear, secured with the 2 brooches, and no shirt underneath. And he's sitting there. He's got Willem Dafoe's head, because after Fjolnir took over, he had his ears cut off and his tongue cut out and his eyes gouged out before killing him. And so he's got this, like, it looks mummified Willem Dafoe head, and there's, like, stones in his eye sockets, and I don't know, it looked like maybe a piece of wood or leather stuck in his mouth, because he's like, oh, he had his tongue cut out and his eyes gouged out, but I made him new ones.
It's the creepiest line. It's like, that was one of the few times that this movie, like, the creepy factor of this movie genuinely got me. It was like that line, and I was like, oh, that's gross. But
then it's immediately followed by a funnier line, because he looks at it and he's like, oh, I'm gonna get revenge for you as well.
Right.
He says, you're gonna have to talk to me. I didn't give him any new ears. Which is funny. The He-Witch says you're going to need this Nightblade, which is some ancient mythical blade. It can only be drawn at night or in the shadow of this volcano. That the farm is, like, at the base of this volcano. It looks like it's maybe a day's hike away. Volcano physics are not strict in this movie. They're a little bit loose, but it's a myth brought to life, so it's okay. He tells him about this sword. He tells him where to find it, and the sword prop looks really cool. The weapons were made by the same guy who designed the weapons for Game of Thrones.
Nice.
And so it's like this Viking short sword. It's got runes engraved on it. It looks like it's made of Damascus steel. It's got the ripples, or maybe like meteoric iron. It's a really cool looking sword.
Oh, yeah.
And so he goes from the He Witch's cave to a burial mound, where he finds this. Almost reminded me of like a Legend of Zelda boss fight, because he goes, it's like this little boss arena, and sitting on a chair is this corpse. He almost looks like the ghosts from Return of the King.
Yeah.
And he's got the sword on his lap. And so Amleth goes and grabs the sword, or tries to, and then the corpse wakes up. The corpse, by the way, it's called the Mound Dweller, played by Ian White, who is one of 2 actors in this movie who played the Mountain on Game of Thrones.
Right.
I forget if it's season 1 or season 2 that this guy played him, but
Season 2.
Yeah. And so he has a really cool fight with this Mound Dweller zombie, and he ultimately gets him into the moon's shadow. I think that has an effect of paralyzing him, and then taking the sword and cutting his head off. And he takes his head and shoves it into his crotch. He takes the Mound Dweller's head and shoves it into the Mound Dweller's crotch. And then he looks over, and like you were saying with the camera movement, it pans over to across the length of the room to Amleth just standing there in front of the zombie with his hand on the sword still. And this time he takes it and the zombie crumbles.
Right. It's almost like a dream sequence.
Yeah, like it was in his head.
Right.
And then he just gets out. He comes back to the farm. He is hiding behind a building because Fjolnir and a couple of his men are coming by, and he's kind of getting ready to strike. One of the dogs, or the farm dog who comes back later, is growling at him. And then again with the animal imagery, he growls back at the dog. And Fjolnir's like, okay, it's almost dawn. Let's get out of here.
There's a moment then too where he tries to get the sword open, and that's when
I was gonna get to that, because he goes to the barracks, the female slave barracks, and he sees Fjolnir come in, and he is, I want Olga. And then I love this, because she stands up, she knows what he's trying to do.
Right.
And she just lifts up her, because they're all in long shifts. She lifts it up, and you can see that she's got essentially a cloth pad on. And he says, a little blood never hurt anybody. And so she rips it off and shoves it in his mouth.
It's the coolest up yours scene.
It's
ever.
great, and it works too.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't try and mess with her again. But that's when Amleth tries to draw the sword, and we see that it literally cannot be drawn during the daytime. And then he kind of chides himself. He says, I'm an idiot. My fate says that I have to kill him underneath this mountain. Fate and destiny is a really big part of it. Where they discuss the deities that are literally spinning the thread of each person's fate, best depicted in Hercules.
Oh, yes.
And so he talks to Olga later that day and essentially says, I'm gonna just torment this farm until I'm allowed by fate to get my revenge.
Take it.
And so does the sports game come before that or after that?
It comes directly before it.
Yeah,
So he has that moment of I'm going to torture the living snot out of all these people.
And so he follows a couple of we get reunited with Thorir, who is Fjolnir's eldest son, who was a baby in the opening, and now he's like
a 17, 18-year-old.
Yeah, and he's just like, he's a brat. It's shown that he sucks at fighting. He's like training in the background and just easily gets wiped out.
He would have been a finance bro at some university with a freaking Greek system.
Absolutely. He gives me kind of Theon Greyjoy vibes, where he's like so arrogant and narcissistic, but at the same time so incompetent.
Right.
So he becomes a character. And so his friends, I think the people who are training with him when they first arrive on the farm, Amleth like follows them into their hut with the sword and then chops them into pieces and nails them to the side of the hut in the shape of like a centaur. And it is
gruesome.
It's gruesome. And it's like, it immediately cuts from that to people freaking out in the morning. We see Thorir like losing his mind, and he starts just, and then it pans over and shows what actually happened. He starts accusing people, or no, it is after the sports game, because Amleth is like in a position of superiority over the other slaves. He's like, do as you're told. But he starts just randomly accusing the slaves of doing this because these cultures, they were all viewing each other as being savage. The noseless guy has a great line of like, well, I mean, could it be the Christians? Their god is a corpse nailed to a tree.
That line just like,
oh, it's so good. There's a lot of that in The Lost Kingdom, or The Last Kingdom on Netflix. It's a Viking show, and there's a lot of just those like Norse people just not getting the concept of Christianity. They're like, wait, what?
One man
if
dies
he's immortal, then how did he die?
And also, why did he let himself die?
Yeah, if he's so powerful, then I think that's actually like a line. It's like, if he's so powerful, then why did he let himself get nailed to a tree?
Yeah.
So that's a funny line. But before that, they go to a sports game. It looks like it's maybe something that later developed into hockey.
Yeah, or rugby or something like that. It's played with sticks.
Yeah.
It's like field hockey.
Right. And we see immediately that it's brutal. There are people either being killed or being knocked out the entire game. There's this one player on the other team who's like really into it, massive, Hafthor Bjornsson, who played the Mountain in seasons 4 through 8. The guy who played into the very end seems like such a sweet guy.
Oh yeah.
I love him in this. And so it gets down to just be him and Amleth. And then Gunnar, the youngest, because he's like from the sidelines going like, you're ruining our family's name, because it's a competition between them and like another nobleman elsewhere in Iceland. And so he just runs onto the field and grabs the ball. Yeah. And he's like, I'm going to score. And then the Hafthor Bjornsson just lays that kid out.
Oh, yeah.
And he sets the ball next to his head. And he's going to effectively kill him by like launching the ball through his head. And then Amleth tackles him to the ground and headbutts him to death. Yeah. We don't see that gore. We just see like the blood splatter up on his face. But the sound effects and everything, it's gnarly. And so that's what gets him the respect of the family.
Right, because Gunnar lives.
Gunnar lives. And they're like trying to wake him up, and he opens his eyes, he's like, did we win?
The ultimate sportsman.
Great line. There's a lot of there's some great comedy in this movie. Yeah. I love it. And so after that is when Thorir pulls him aside. It's like after they get back to the farm, because there's like this, I think maybe it's a Yuletide festival, because they're wearing like holly crowns and running around naked and having sex with each other. And it's like intercutting between that and Amleth being told, okay, you've proven your loyalty to us. You're going to have certain privileges. You're not going to be worked as hard. You're going to be able to order other slaves around, but you're not going to be free.
Right.
He specifically says, like, a low-born slave can never escape his status, which is kind of a scummy thing to say. Also, in light of what we learn about his stepmother, kind of out of place, and also because he's a prince.
Right.
He has higher birth standing than Thorir himself. And so he even says, we'll even let you pick out a wife, maybe even Olga, because we know that you've been eyeing her, and Fjolnir has decided that he doesn't want to try and sexually assault her anymore because she fights back. And so he finds Olga, and they have sex, and she prays to her gods. There's a couple mentions that they worship different pantheons. That she worships, like, I guess, nature spirits.
Yeah.
But they're cuddling and talking, and she's vowing to help him with his revenge. And she has the idea that there are mushrooms in this forest that we can use that to our advantage. Another instance of hallucinogenic mushrooms in this movie.
Absolute classic.
Yeah. So after that, because he says, no, I'm going to make them suffer first. And so that's when the centaur thing happens. And then it's after that, right, because they decide that this is witchcraft. Because the Fjolnir says, no, none of the slaves could have done it because none of them have weapons.
Right.
There's a logical explanation. It's obviously a troll. And so they're going to do a human sacrifice. They have two priests, like a priest and a priestess, that live on the farm with them. And so they have a girl, I think one of the slaves, like, tied up, and they're going to have her as a human sacrifice. He kills one of the priests, hangs him from the ceiling with his intestines hanging out, and frees the slave girl. Right. Just another blow that he does. And it continues like that, where he's pretending to be like a vengeful spirit. Right. And just psyching them out. Which is, I like it.
It feels very cathartic after obviously taking Amleth's side and kind of seeing what he has to go through, especially with Thorir and being literally steps away from his fate, but having to wait for it.
And also seeing glimpses of his mother, who at this point, he still has his rose-tinted glasses on. She is still his damsel in distress. He has to save his mother. And so he tells Olga, okay, now we're going to use the mushrooms. Because after all of the stuff, they decide, okay, Fjolnir says, okay, all you slaves, this is your home too. We're going to give you sharpened sticks, and you're going to help us defend it. And so Olga makes mushroom stew and passes it around to all the guards so that they go nuts. And a lot of them just start stabbing themselves. So that wipes out, a lot of it. And he uses that opportunity to go to Fjolnir's hut. And that's where he sees his father's ring. He sees all this other stuff. And then his mom comes in, Nicole Kidman, and he hides behind this loom, which I guess is also very historically accurate, this specific loom that she uses. Which is another cool through line. She goes and she starts to get undressed. He reveals himself and he says, I'm your son. I'm here to get you out. He says that he tells Olga, like, if we have to, I'll let Gunnar come with us. He's not gonna punish Gunnar for being Fjolnir's son because he's also his mother's son. And she essentially, this is where the hat drops, and she's like, oh, I see you're as dumb as your father. She explains that she and Ethan Hawke never loved each other. She was his slave. She shows him the brand. Apparently he sexually assaulted her, got her pregnant, married her. So that's part of why she never really liked Amleth, is because she never wanted him. He was literally forced on her. And then she talks about how Fjolnir, who was a bastard, never cared that she was a slave, and so loved her for who she was, even though he would then, through the course of the movie, go on and sexually assault slaves exactly the same way that she did. More of that cycle. But so she says that it was her idea to kill Ethan Hawke. She says she begged him to do it and to kill Amleth. So that's obviously a blow. He thinks that she's lying. She gets creepy, and I think this is just showing, like, really what she's doing is she's trying to get him on edge so that she can steal his sword and kill him. But she says, essentially, if you kill my husband and my kids, then you would be my new king. And she starts making out with him. They do kiss. And then she cuts him, and he freaks out and leaves. And she's just standing there laughing, kind of like a maniac. And I think that's, in a lot of ways, this is the scene where the charade drops in Nicole Kidman's performance. And she does the two versions, like the kind of meek, stoic character, and then the character who is like, has more autonomy and is actively working against Amleth. I liked that she was given that level of autonomy. Oh, totally.
It makes her feel like more of her own character, really.
A character who is like allowed to be involved in the plot. Right. So then, out of his rage, because he doesn't feel like he can kill his own mother, that's a no-no, he goes and kills Thorir in his sleep. Yep. By stabbing him in the gut. Yeah, it's a pretty cool shot where he walks in and he holds up the sword, and then the camera pans down to below the bed, and you see the blade go through. It's a very good shot. And then he meets up with Olga, and he says, I'm going to have to run and go into hiding because I just killed Thorir. He cut out Thorir's heart, too, which is kind of messed up. And he says, you need to stay here because it'll keep you safe if they don't know that you helped me. And then he runs off. The next day, Fjolnir is devastated. Really good performance from this actor. Oh, yeah. He's freaking out. Nicole Kidman says, this isn't anything supernatural. This is my son, Amleth. You need to kill him. And so she is full-on villain now. She is working against Amleth. And then Fjolnir just starts, at random, slicing the slaves' throats because he realizes, okay, he couldn't have done this alone. He had to have had help. And then he's about to cut Anya Taylor-Joy's throat. She brilliantly, like, all the other slaves are scared, and she looks at him and she's like, oh, I see you're no longer scared of a woman's blood. Great line. Before he can do anything to her, Amleth shows up and says, I have your son's heart. I believe that it's a culture where, like, you have to have a full and complete burial in order to be full and complete in the afterlife. So it's a big deal that his heart is missing. And so he says, I will give you your son's heart if you let her go. And he, instead of, like, cutting any kind of deal, they just attack him. Right. They don't even try to negotiate. And another touch that I like is because he's got the Nightblade that can't be drawn, and so he uses it in its scabbard as, like, a blunt weapon to fight them. Olga gets away. 2 or 3 of Fjolnir's guys. And it's only because he gets distracted, like, watching her run away, making sure that she gets away, that he gets knocked out. Right. And then they drag him into the barn. They're beating the hell out of him. Or no, they first... Fjolnir takes the bag and he says, oh, now you have nothing to bargain with. He says, is it... are you sure that it's your son's heart or is it the dog's heart? Because that was during his rampage. More animal imagery, went out and started howling with the wolves to somehow rile them up, that made the dog go crazy and try to kill Fjolnir, and so Fjolnir had to kill the dog. And he says, is it your son's heart or is it the dog's heart? And so that's when he takes him in and starts torturing him, trying to get him to give up the heart. And he says specifically, I'm going to cut out your heart and your mother and I are going to eat it. Which is... oof.
Yeah.
And so I forget specifically why he gets pulled away from the interrogation. But that's when a crow, the representation of his father, comes in and pecks the rope down. He hallucinates being taken out to Valhalla by a Valkyrie. Beautiful looking Valkyrie.
Oh, yeah.
The costume is so great. She's got like golden chainmail, a cape that's like a gorgeous red on the outside and then goose feathers on the inside. Her teeth, they look like maybe she has braces, but actually it was a real custom in some of those kingdoms to file runes into teeth and then fill them with like paints and pigments. And so she has runes carved into her teeth.
Wow.
It's awesome. And then he wakes up and it's just Olga has carried him to a hot spring. And then this is another scene that I really like in a revenge story, is he essentially decides, I'm done with this revenge. I want to leave. I want to run away with you.
Yeah.
He is willingly leaving it behind. And so they just say, we're gonna get on a boat and we're gonna leave.
And that's when they find her. She reveals that she's pregnant, right?
Yes, because what happens is we have Thorir's funeral, which is another really cool scene. It's when Fjolnir now vows revenge on Amleth. They do a bunch more sacrifices. They sacrifice a horse. They sacrifice one of their women. And they have they bury him in the boat. And then later on, when they're talking to Ralph Ineson, another Game of Thrones vet, he was in The Witch, he was in The Green Knight. He's the shipmaster that they get on. He says, we were expecting Fjolnir's son. And Olga says, he left early and took his own ship. Which I only caught that the second time through.
Nice.
And so, he looks at the little wound on her neck where the knife was held, and then he has another vision of that heart tree. And this time it pans up above his father, above him, to two kids, a boy and a girl. And so he says, you're pregnant. And she says, I didn't want to tell you until after I was sure that the baby would be safe. And that's what clicks in his head. He's like, as long as Fjolnir's out there, the baby won't be safe. And so he says to the captain, he says, okay, take her here. I have relatives here. We'll be safe. And then he jumps off the boat and swims to shore. She casts a spell to put air in the sails, and then she sails away to safety. And so this is when we're like in the end game of the movie. He comes back, and now he's not just getting vengeance; he's protecting his family.
Right.
Which I like that they did that, and I also like that they subverted it.
Right.
Whereas like he's walking away, and then he ultimately fulfills his vengeance not out of selfishness, but out of love for someone else. And so he goes back into the village. Everyone's just pissed. Everyone wants to kill him. He finds the noseless guy, and he like pins him up against the house and lines the sword up against his nose hole. And he says, like, when I was a pup, I took a little bit of your nose, and now the wolf is back, and he wants the whole thing. Stabs it through his head. It's a cool shot.
Very cool kill. Very cool.
We cut to Fjolnir getting ready, and he says to Nicole Kidman and Gunnar, you guys have to stay safe. No matter what you hear, stay hidden. And then he goes out to fight. So Amleth makes his way back to the hut, finds it pretty much empty, and then very much not staying hidden, Nicole Kidman jumps out and starts attacking him, and she gets a couple hits. She's slicing him up.
That being said, he's not really fighting back.
Yeah, until the end, and that's why I think it's so important that like they really hammer home the animal thing, because this next scene is like pure instinct. He is not thinking through his actions. He is an animal going off of instinct, because he stabs her right through the heart.
Oh yeah.
And then Gunnar jumps out of the closet, now to avenge his mother, jumps onto his shoulders and starts just shanking the hell out of him. And he throws him off and does a spin, and Gunnar's dead, this 8-year-old kid. And that's where, watching it, I was like, oh, he's not getting out of this. A combination of, like, how do you come back from that and the wounds? Because he's bleeding now. He's not in great shape. And then so as soon as Gunnar's dead, he turns around and you just see Fjolnir in the doorway. And he picks up the corpses and he essentially says, I'll meet you at the volcano, at the gates of hell, and we'll have our final duel.
3 p.m., the basketball court. Be there.
Yeah, and so Amleth frees all the slaves on the farm. They just start burning down buildings, and we never see them again. He hikes up to the volcano. We see that Fjolnir has laid out Nicole Kidman and Gunnar in like a burial stance. He sacrificed his horse. I think it's like the sacrificed horse is meant to carry them to the afterlife. And they're all like, they're covered in soot, and Amleth goes and he says his goodbyes, and he says we'll all be together again in Valhalla, because they were all killed with iron. And then he kind of psychs himself up and then just walks into, it's like a great shot where he just walks into the steam and the darkness. And then he and Fjolnir have a naked fight. They are
naked,
buck naked this whole fight. And it's so beautifully shot. The timing is weird, because it's very obviously daytime when he finds the bodies and is saying farewell, and then when the fight happens, it's night. And you can see like the lava flow coming everywhere. It's such a gorgeous fight. You can see like their silhouettes against the like smoke and the glow, and it's just really good.
It makes the composition is really interesting for me, just because it makes it more difficult to pick out who's who.
Yeah, for sure.
Which kind of lends itself to the entire battle.
Because at this point it doesn't really matter.
Oh, right.
They're both kind of almost the same level.
Right.
Of just, what did you do?
Right. They're both going for the same thing. Right. They both know the outcome.
Yeah. And it couldn't have ended any other way, because they end up, Fjolnir gets some good hits in, because again, Amleth is not in great shape. When he takes his shirt off, he's got like these open wounds all over the place. He's not in top shape. And then so there's the scene that always happens where he's like down on his knee, and Fjolnir says some villain things, and then he comes back stronger, and it like almost goes in slow motion for a second, because Amleth cuts off Fjolnir's head the second Fjolnir's sword goes through his heart.
Right.
And so Fjolnir dies the exact same way, almost the exact same way that his brother did, being decapitated, and then Amleth lays down with the sword sticking out of his chest in the volcano, and then we hear voiceover from Olga. We see a shot of Anya Taylor-Joy now in like the traditional Scandinavian smock with the buckles and everything, holding a pair of twins like he saw in his vision. And she just says, "We're safe. We made it. You can make your journey." And then we see the Valkyrie again, and she's carrying him up. It's like an opening in the sky that looks like the opening to to a great hall, you can like see the outline of pillars and everything. And I love how it's done because she gets almost to the door, and then it cuts to black, and the credits roll. And it's so beautiful.
Oh yeah,
so beautifully shot, so beautifully paced.
That the entire sequence, because like up until the point of where Amleth is killing his mother and half brother, at least for me, like it felt like Amleth had the skills to make it through, and he had obviously he had the motivation to make it through. But after that point, you realize that like he's not coming back from this,
physically or emotionally,
right? And so the catharsis of like him making that final journey on the back of the Valkyrie,
and just he's done.
Yeah, his task is complete, and now he can rest. And it's a beautiful way to end a beautiful film. That's for sure.
Yeah, very, very good.
Oh yeah.
So that's The Northman.
Yeah.
Go see it.
Highly recommended.
It's not for everybody. If you're sensitive to gore, don't go see it. I would say if you're familiar with Robert Eggers' work, definitely go see it. It's not as bizarre and out there as some of his other films.
Yeah,
it's
definitely
more subdued. But highly, highly recommend. Yeah. Very good movie.
For me as well.
Yeah.